Hey, how's it going, everybody? Shaun here for another semi-daily movie review. Today, we're going to be talking about the just-released film Mank, directed by David Fincher, written by Jack Fincher, David Fincher's late father. It stars Gary Oldman, Amanda Seyfried, Lily Collins, Tom Pelphrey, Arliss Howard, Tuppence Middleton, Monica Grossman, Joseph Cross, Toby Leonard Moore, and others. The plot synopsis logline is follow screenwriter Herman J. Mankiewicz's tumultuous development of Orson Welles' iconic masterpiece, Citizen Kane. So, yeah, a few weeks ago, I did a solo episode of Zoobox Goes to the Movies, and I just kind of talked about David Fincher and Orson Welles and some of the comments that David Fincher made in the press while promoting this movie. And how he kind of has a, let's say, less than an affinity for Orson Welles. He respects him. He kind of puts him in the category of all these other filmmakers that made an impression on his life and himself as a filmmaker, but he doesn't find him very important. He thought he was immature and petulant. And apparently this is kind of a legend that has gone on in Hollywood for a while. It started in the 70s, in the early 70s, with film critic for The Village Voice, Pauline Kael, wrote kind of this expose, and she made this theory, or she told the story in the sense that Orson Welles was kind of a spoiled brat and didn't actually have much to do with the screenplay for Citizen Kane. That it was mostly Herman Mankiewicz, or Mank, that had basically done it himself, and Orson bullied his way into getting a screenwriting credit. Now, if you actually know the real story, this has been debunked pretty widely, even a few years after that piece was written for Pauline Kael. But even to this day, when they reprint her work, when you can go buy a collection of Pauline Kael essays, that one still is there with no corrections. So that's probably why the legend has persisted so long. It's a very kind of uncharitable view on the process, the pre-production process of making Citizen Kane. So with that, let's just talk about the movie. Before I get into any spoilers or any specifics, I'll just kind of talk broadly what I thought about the movie. If you don't know, I am a massive fan of Orson Welles. I'm also a pretty big fan of David Fincher. In terms of modern filmmakers, he's one of my guys. He's probably in my top 10. He does great work with kind of procedurals, things that kind of explore the darker sides of humanity and about obsession and meticulousness, and it's kind of reflected in the way he makes movies. Famously, that's the kind of guy he is. He's the kind of dude that will go and do 100 takes of something until he sees exactly what he wants. So he's that kind of filmmaker. And the stories, when he tells stories that kind of involve people that are obsessive about what they're doing to that level, it's more of an intellectual statement. It's more abstract, what makes it interesting. Not so much the story, because anytime he tries to get into things that involve a more of an earnest or a melodramatic story, he often stumbles. I would say the biggest stumble he's had in his career, outside of, say, Alien 3, but I give him a little bit of pass on that because that's more studio interference. That's not his instincts failing him. Would be The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, which is a beautifully made movie, rather. It's, it's big, it's broad, it looks beautiful, the cinematography is incredible, the music is incredible, the performances are pretty good. But there's something about it that just falls flat. He just can't execute on earnest melodrama, I guess. And now that we've come to Mank, we have something more akin to A Curious Case of Benjamin Button. Even though it does kind of have some of the thematic hallmarks that he is known for, obsession, meticulousness, in terms of the character Mank and how he goes about his work. And if you don't know about Herman Mankiewicz, he was kind of a workman writer in Hollywood in the 30s and 40s. And had a lot of problems with alcoholism, but he was kind of considered a genius despite all that. He was so good at what he did. He was so good at structure. He was so good at dialogue that they kind of just kept him around, even though he caused them a lot of trouble, the studios. He was very outspoken, kind of sardonic wit, often referred to as this kind of self-made court jester. That's also used against him a few times in his life. He just couldn't take anything too seriously. A funny dude, by all accounts. And this movie kind of gets into his character and his life more than actually being about the creation of writing Citizen Kane. That's more of like a backdrop. It's used as like a narrative device where where you see him kind of secluded on this ranch that he's supposed to like dry out and write the screenplay or write a version of the screenplay or work the story out for Citizen Kane. And then it does flashbacks to things that you would, inform the scenes that he's writing. Even though it doesn't spend much time with him actually writing scenes. It is much more of a character piece. It is much more just about like kind of this alcoholic writer that has a like pangs of conscience. There's also a lot of elements that involved the gubernatorial race of the time with Upton Sinclair, and kind of how they're all sympathetic to, I guess, more socialist ideals, and how he dealt with William Randolph Hearst, which was somebody that he actually knew, would go to his house and go to parties and stuff like that. He was in the social circle that he had access to William Randolph Hearst. And because William Randolph Hearst like slights him is basically what they imply is the impetus for him to want to go after this story, or to make it more heavily about William Randolph Hearst than maybe it would have been otherwise. And the movie itself, I will say, I have a lot of mixed feelings about. I don't think overall it works very well, and it can be kind of frustrating just on a structural level and on a level of just focus and making its point. I mean, the only real takeaway of the movie is like, man, he was a genius and he had integrity. And Orson Welles was an evil monster, and William Randolph Hearst was a monster. Trying to kind of draw parallels in some respect to William Randolph Hearst's like behavior and attitude, and Orson Welles. You got to remember, like, Orson Welles was very young at the time. So, like, in fairness, I'm sure he was egotistical and brash and a little narcissistic. But to suggest that like he is not the anchor of Citizen Kane seems really short-sighted. And the movie leaves out large swaths of the actual story of the creation of the script. And we'll get into that kind of stuff a little bit later. But good things about the movie, the things that I did enjoy. I'm a big Gary Oldman fan. I think Gary Oldman does a great job. It's another great Gary Oldman performance. And what can I say? The man is good at what he does. He brings a humanity and a vulnerability to the character. He does seem to capture the character, like the spirit of Herman Mankiewicz. It is a full-bodied performance. It's just like you would expect from Gary Oldman. It's a little showy. It's a little theatrical, as Oldman is one to do. Looking back at his career, even just a few years ago, he won an Academy Award for The Darkest Hour. That's a little larger than life. That's not necessarily a realistic portrayal of a character. When he's Winston Churchill, he's very big in that movie, but good though. It's modulated to the movie that he's in. And I would say the same thing for Mank. Mank is very stylized. From everything from the way it's shot in black and white. There's lots of use of like old film techniques in terms of the visual look, because it was shot in digital, but what they did in post was to try to make it look like a movie of the era. It's got a lot of soft light, a lot of glow to the film, to the look of the movie. It's trying to make it look like vintage classic, fairy tale-esque, almost like what your mind's eye would think of when they think back on something like Casablanca, right? Think back about like how that movie looked. It's trying to create not necessarily literally what it looked like, but what you feel like it looked like. And I think largely it's successful in that, which is credit to the cinematographer. Pull up this dude, because I had never heard of this guy. Eric Messerschmidt. I want to say he's done mostly television. He worked on Mindhunter, another show spearheaded by David Fincher. But he's mostly done TV, so I think this might be his first feature film. as a director of photography, and I think overall, I think he does pretty good work. I was definitely into the look of the film, the music by Trent Reznor and Atticus Finch coming back again, frequent collaborators in the past, 15 years of Fincher's, and they deliver a classical movie kind of score, and I think it works really well. Um, but yeah, that's kind of where my positives end for the movie, unfortunately. Well, other than the performances, I thought Charles Dance as William Foster Kane was awesome. I thought he did a great job. I thought, what's his name? Arliss Howard, who plays Louis B. Mayer, he plays the head of MGM Studios. Another great performance. And all the performances are kind of stylized. They're kind of, even the dialogue itself is kind of purposefully old fashioned, especially in the first hour of the movie, the first half of the movie. It's got kind of that quippy 1940s fast talking vibe to it. And honestly, that's probably what represents the best parts of the movie, when it does feel like kind of this fast paced screwball-esque comedy dramedy thing. Like, that's when it works the best. When it gets a little bit more melodramatic in the second half, is kind of where it starts falling apart a little bit, in my opinion. And I think it just kind of buckles under its own weight. It's trying to tell this, what is ultimately an intimate story, but kind of do it in a way that makes it feel big and legendary, rather than kind of looking for realism, which is interesting for Fincher, because Fincher's usually known for a guy that goes in, and while things might have a certain style to them, if you think of something like his earlier work like Seven or Fight Club, it does feel like still it takes place in like the real, actual, tangible world. It doesn't like break the laws of existence. Where I think Mank is tilted slightly into the fantastical, and not really in a bad way either. I wouldn't say necessarily it's not a bad thing that it does that. It's just that when it wants to get more literal and more serious, I thought it kind of lost its way a little bit. The way the guy who played Orson Welles, his name is Tom Burke. Orson Welles is not in the movie very much. His presence is kind of always there, but like actually interacting with Orson, not a ton, which is one of the problems, in the sense that like that's not true. Orson Welles was very intimately involved in writing the story, and they actually spent a lot of time before they even started writing, like breaking down the story, breaking down the characters, breaking down what kind of scenes should be in the movie, how they would build the structure out and stuff like that. He was actually very heavily involved. And even when Mank was off on the ranch writing his version of the screenplay, Orson Welles was back at home while doing other things, while being an actor and doing his Mercury Theater stuff, and also the radio stuff. That he was also doing his own version of the screenplay in parallel, and he was constantly getting sent pages from Mank and sending back notes and refining, et cetera, et cetera. And then after they were done, a lot of what sculpted the script was Orson Welles after the fact. Mank wrote a tome. It was like 340 pages or something like that, which they only kind of make light mention of in the movie, that's what it was. They say like, oh my God, you're 90 pages and you're not even done with the first act. Because that was kind of true. But the movie doesn't represent that as being a thing that Orson Welles actually had to contend with. Orson Welles is a cartoon character, for lack of a better way to put it. Some of that is purposeful because it's part of the style. Like, he's almost presented as like a villain right away, like the shadowy villain, and you hear his voice and he comes in and out of frame like during these sequences, and he's kind of a voice on the phone, kind of this idea of him being like the radio star of the time. It like really translates that pretty well. And as somebody, I've recently listened to some of Wells's radio work, definitely responded to that, because the guy does a great vocal impression of Orson Welles, even if he doesn't actually look or seem like Orson Welles at all in reality and real, like the real person. But his voice was perfect. They nailed it. All right, so at this point, I'm going to just be a little more free with what I'm going to talk about. And but anyways, I think the movie is okay. It was an okay movie. I have some problems with it because of the intentions of the movie. It seems unnecessarily mean spirited and pedantic towards Orson Welles, and I don't even mean that because it's like Orson Welles is dead. What do I give a shit, right? But it's you could feel it. You could feel like this kind of contempt for Welles in the movie, and that's what was so weird. Like when I read the stuff that Fincher had said about Welles recently, was that like it seemed like it was coming from a person that was like a contemporary of Welles, and he was like angry at him during the time maybe he would have acted out as a young man, a young filmmaker. It didn't bring in the power of hindsight because you get to Orson Welles is a finite thing in history. He's a finite experience. You can look at his entire life, and to suggest that he was just some sort of like paranoid, spoiled, aristocratic, out of touch, didn't give a fuck about the people that he worked with, it seems not true. And if things are to be believed, if you go look at some Welles researchers, even at the time that wasn't true. He wasn't really like that. He was he wanted what he wanted for sure. I mean, he was an artist. And when you see Citizen Kane, this movie from 1941, that it was so ahead of its time that it took film culture 40 years to catch up to the kind of stuff that he was doing in Citizen Kane. Yeah, some of that's on the page, I'm sure. A good script is important, but it's only part of the equation. You have to go shoot it. You have to go, you have to go edit it. You got to do everything else that goes into it. All that stuff. And I can't imagine that like Mank's original manuscript would have had everything that encompasses Citizen Kane, all the little flourishes and whatnot. So I found that annoying because I knew better. I just knew the story. Not the one that was presented here necessarily, but I know a lot about the production of Citizen Kane and the rest of Welles's life, his history. So it's clear that he came to this project, with a certain reverence for Herman J. Mankiewicz and kind of a resentful attitude towards Orson Welles himself. Now, maybe he got that from his father. His father was like a famous journalist and essayist, and this was a script that his father wrote like back in the 80s or maybe early 90s, and they just could never get it off the ground. Apparently, they were supposed to make this. I think he was supposed to make this after the game. So that would have been, it would have taken the place of Fight Club if that had actually happened. But financing fell through because he wanted to do this black and white movie. Studio disagreed, so it just kind of went the way of the dodo. But just coming back to the movie itself, like the thing that I thought was so weird was that it actually doesn't deal with, like I said before, it doesn't really deal with like Orson Welles or the making of Citizen Kane very much. So when it's kind of billed as this the true story behind Citizen Kane type thing, it felt a little odd because all of that stuff is all kind of backloaded into the movie, and the pieces that they show you of Mankiewicz's life often have nothing to do with Welles or or this moment of consternation, this moment of, there's a moment in the movie where Welles is actually there and he goes to the ranch to talk to him, and he says that he wants a screen credit for it. And Orson Welles like has a meltdown and starts throwing shit around the room. And then that gives Mankiewicz the inspiration for when Charles Foster Kane does it at the end of Citizen Kane, when he destroys that room. That's just like an example of one of these like kind of cliche, clunky moments in the movie. He's like, oh, there needs to be a moment of aggression to crescendo. What's happening here? And it also tries to kind of give Marion Davies, William Randolph Hearst's wife, his lady, try to give her kind of a life and show her as more of a real person, because a lot of the people think that the character in Citizen Kane, the one that Kane ends up like kind of showering and forcing into the spotlight forcing her to, because she wanted to be a singer, so he builds an opera for her and stuff, and she's spoiled and she's kind of I don't know, a drunk, a spinster, becomes a lonely spinster because of Kane. A lot of people think that it's directly based on Marion Davies, and it's not. Same thing with William Randolph Hearst. Like Charles Foster Kane is like an amalgamation of a couple people. It's not just William Randolph Hearst, but Hearst was in a position, being the newspaper tycoon that he was, that he took offense to it, and he tried to bury Orson Welles. They even tried to buy the print for Citizen Kane from RKO Pictures so they could burn it. They did not want this movie to come out. They saw it as a personal attack. And actually, in this movie, they kind of make the case that it is a little bit of a personal attack. Because Mank's like, oh, I got slighted. So it is personal. But he tries to have his cake and eat it too, because he's like, goes up to Marion Davies and he's like, I hope you can forgive me. I don't know. But yeah, there was just some incongruencies with like the way the movie kind of wraps up and what it's ultimately trying to say. It just kind of like goes hard into this like Orson Welles didn't do anything. I did it all. Pivot towards the end. And it just kind of seems like it's like unrealistic. And the movie's full of moments where you're like, well, this is obviously bullshit. I mean, granted, I'm not necessarily somebody that's looking for historical accuracy or realism to the nth degree when you see something like this. I mean, I grew up watching Oliver Stone movies. Oliver Stone used to play pretty fast and loose with history. Not even history that was that long ago. I mean, JFK made in 1994. Nixon made a couple years after that. And those movies have wildly diverged at points from the actual known history of those events and people. So I don't really have a problem with that per se. It's just almost just like this. It felt unnecessary. Like, you don't have to tear into Orson Welles to make the case that Herman Mankiewicz did good work and tried really hard, and that this was a part of the creative process. Honestly, it would have been cool to watch a movie that was more intimately, specifically about them writing the story. Also, if you're not aware of a lot of this history, this Hollywood history, you might be kind of lost. It does not do a great job of kind of contextualizing this world and even contextualizing who some of the people are. It just kind of assumes on some level that you already know this story, which makes it feel less urgent, less interesting. Like, I just couldn't, it was hard to invest in the movie. Actually, when I first started watching it, I passed out. I fell asleep. And then I ended up waking up. So I watched like 45 minutes of the movie. I didn't know how much I missed. I was like, I don't know if I fell asleep for more. So I actually watched like the first half of the movie like twice. And it's weird. Like, it's pretty coherent and cohesive for the first half. It's in that second half when it's trying to bring this thing full circle to be more about Mankiewicz getting screwed by Welles. I don't know, because it ends with the only Academy Award famously Citizen Kane won was for Best Screenplay, and neither Welles nor Mank were there to receive it. So he's giving like an interview afterwards, and they're talking to him like, well, if I was to give a speech, I would have said this script had nothing to do with Orson Welles at all. And that was it. And then the movie ends like on that note. Just thought it was kind of weird. Unnecessary. It didn't add anything to it. In fact, it makes the drama just seem pedantic. That was the most surprising thing about this, especially coming from Fincher. Like, he went for just like the easy, dumb, non-complex way of kind of approaching these things. Even Mankiewicz is not a very complex character as presented in the movie. Actually, none of them are. Nobody is. Nobody feels like they really grow or they learn or they change or they got better at something, they got worse at something. They don't really lose anything. It's kind of meandering. I was kind of shocked. At some point, I'm sure I'll go and revisit Mank. Like I said, his feelings about Welles aside, I actually kind of like David Fincher. I like him a lot. Come on, he's got a murderer's row of movies. He's got Seven, The Game, Fight Club, Panic Room, Gone Girl, the best Lifetime movie ever made. I mean, he's a good director, and it's weird. Like, there's such a weird backlash to him these days. Not just because of this Wells stuff, but I didn't no idea that there was like a pretty large subset of film fans and film writers and stuff that don't really like David Fincher. I don't know why. Some people, I saw a lot of stuff about like just his nihilism, nihilistic point of view. Kind of makes the same thing over and over again, which in some respects is fair, but that's, you can look at the filmography of a lot of directors, and there's always similar themes. You know, I'm a big fan of Stanley Kubrick. Kubrick's movies, all of his movies, at the end of the day, the subtext, the thematics of it, are very similar to each other. They're all kind of having a conversation about the same ideas. Fincher is very similar, and this, and I would say Benjamin Button, are kind of departures from that perspective, that point of view. And I think he kind of fails. I think he failed at both of them. So it doesn't actually give me any pleasure or anything not to like Mank. I was excited for Mank, you know. I started getting a little weary when I was reading those interviews and stuff a couple weeks ago. But even then, I was still looking forward to it. A new Fincher movie? Come on. What's not to be excited about? I love it. I love the dude. Zodiac's one of my favorite movies. I forgot to say Zodiac. Zodiac's one of my all-time favorites. I would probably put that in a top 20 at least. Maybe it might even break the top 10. Zodiac fucking rules. Anything else I have to say? Any other closing thoughts? Yeah, I don't know. Kind of let down. A little disappointed in this movie. But like I said, maybe it'll be something that'll grow on me. I don't think so. But if you're a fan of Fincher and you're a fan of Gary Oldman, I would say, it's worth your time to watch, even if you maybe feel unsatisfied with the whole thing. It looks beautiful. The score is beautiful. Gary Oldman's performance is great. Amanda Seyfried's pretty good. Charles Dance, like I said, is incredible. So maybe give it a chance. It's on Netflix right now. You got a Netflix account. You got no excuse. What are you going to do? Watch the Christmas Chronicles 2 again? Well, maybe you will. I don't know. It's got Kurt Russell in it. So that's pretty cool. I haven't watched it yet. I'm going to, though. It's on the Christmas rotation. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to know more about Zoobox, there's a bunch of links in the description for Facebook, Instagram, for my Twitter, for my brother Dan's Twitter. Also, if you'd like to make a recommendation for one of these daily movie reviews or something for Zoobox Goes to the Movies, or even a topic for us to talk about during Zoobox Live or Nightcap or the regular Zoobox Prime, leave it in the comments and we will consider it. We'll put it on the list, as I say. All right, everybody. Be good.